Vanakkam. Welcome to this video on biomechanics. In this video, we will be looking at biomechanics of the spine, spine biomechanics. So, in this class, we will be looking at the anatomy of the spine and the movements that happen in the spine, or movements of the spine. So, what is the spine? It is a set of individual bony structures, 33 in number, that are attached together, that are separated, but at the same time also are attached, between which there can be small movements, but within them there cannot be movements. So, each of this unit, which is a bony structure, is called as a vertebra in singular, vertebrae in plural. Right. Each of these 33 vertebra or vertebrae, within which there can be no movements, between them there can be a small amount of movement. Although a small amount of movement only is possible between these vertebrae, because there can be movement across several vertebrae at the same time, all these movements combine together to produce a net movement that is very visible and sometimes substantial. So, we will start with understanding of these. What is the purpose of this vertebrae? This set of bones, or this column of vertebra that are present in the back, is called sometimes vertebral column. Right. What is the purpose of this vertebral column? There are some 2-3 purposes for this vertebral column. One purpose is to support the head, in particular in humans, because we walk with the bipedal stance, that is, we walk on 2 legs and our hands or the upper limbs are free, they are not used for walking. Unlike quadrupeds, we are bipeds. Because of this reason, the head is held at the top. Not just that, and because in humans, proportional to the body weight, the head is very heavy, proportional to the body weight when compared with other animals. This is true because humans have a very big brain, right? Because of this reason, the head is very heavy. There is a need to support this weight of the head. Because if you do not support the head, then the head will fall down, right? Fall down inside the thorax, right? Fall down inside the thorax. That is not a desirable situation. So, you will have to support the head. So, one primary purpose of the vertebral column is to support the head and the neck and other such structures, structures at the top, right. And also, while you are supporting the head and the neck, you also want to allow for movements of the head and neck. For example, you can watch in the sagittal plane, I can make that movement, right. This is that movement. I can also make that movement, lateral flexion and extension, that movement. I can also rotate my head like this. Right. These movements are also allowed. So, you want to support while at the same time you want to allow some movement of the head. Right. So, this is achieved by the presence of this vertebral column, by this system. Also, another purpose is to provide protection for the nerves that are coming from the brain and that supply information and take information to the brain. Essentially this set of nerves supply information or commands to various parts of the body and also receive information about the state of the body, for example, from various nerves back to the brain. This information goes through set of nerves that pass through a very safe conduit or a very safe hollow path, right, a hole within which they pass. What is the purpose? It is like this pipe. Consider this rigid body, which is the pipe. If you have seen electrical connections at your homes, you will see that the electrical cables are going inside plastic pipes. What is the reason? What is the reason for the electrical cables to go inside the plastic pipes? To protect them from the elements. Maybe because of environment, the electric cables might be affected, or maybe some small animals like rodents might bite them, which might cut the electricity, for example. Because of various such reasons, to protect the cables, you provide a conduit or you provide a rigid body support within which the cables can go. The rigid body itself is not conducting electricity, but this cable is conducting electricity. This is a flexible cable. This is the nerves that pass through within the vertebral column. So, the vertebral column is relatively rigid, right, not rigid between vertebra. That is something that we will discuss, right. Within each vertebra, it is made of bones. Each vertebra is essentially a bone. That is a rigid body, relatively rigid when compared with the nerves itself. There is a need for these nerves to be protected, right. So, for that purpose, you have this protective conduit within which these nerves travel. So, the spinal cord or the vertebral column essentially provides a housing within which the nerves can travel. Nerves of the spinal cord can travel down to inferior structures. Inferior means not something that is inferior in quality. Inferior in technical language from the viewpoint of biomechanics means something that is located at the lower side of the body. Okay, inferior means does not mean that it is bad. Superior means does not mean that it is good. Superior means it is at the top. Inferior means something that is at the lower part of the body. Okay, technical language, not English, not just English, a bit more than that. Okay, so coming back, there are two major purposes of the vertebral column. One is to provide support, essentially to hold the weight of the head and the neck. Why is this important? Especially in humans. Remember, we said at the beginning of this course, this is a course on human biomechanics. Especially in humans, holding the head in this particular position high, especially in bipedal stance, is a very critical biomechanical task. Considering that the weight of the brain, weight of the head with respect to the body weight is very high, this is essentially a very challenging biomechanical task, right. That is one purpose. Head and the neck must be supported. Then also in addition, provide a safe conduit, safe rigid body conduit for the flexible nerves of the central nervous system from the brain to provide command and receive information from the rest of the body. These are the two major purposes of the vertebral column. Okay. So, in these vertebra, there are how many? We said there are 33 vertebra, of which 7 are located at the level of the neck. These are called C1 to C7. C refers to cervical vertebra. Cervical vertebra, there are 7 of them, and there are 12 vertebra at the level of the thorax. Thorax means chest and the back, for example, this part of this thorax, and 5 vertebra, lumbar vertebra, L1 to L5. The thoracic vertebra are named T1 to T12, and there are 5 vertebra that are attached together. These are called sacral vertebra, and 4 fused vertebra, 4 attached vertebra called coccyx or coccygeal vertebra. Okay. There are many ways of counting this. If you count this 5 fused vertebra as 1 and this 4 fused coccygeal vertebra as 1, then the total sum will come to 7 plus 12, 19 plus 5, 24 plus 2, 26. But then we usually count this as 5 sacral vertebra and 4 coccyx vertebra, 4 coccygeal vertebra. Okay. Among this 33 vertebra, the 7 that are located at the level of the neck. So, at this level from approximately here to here, right, in this distance there are 7 vertebrae that is located. In this there are 2 very special vertebrae. The first 2 at the top are called atlas and axis. C1 vertebra is called as atlas. Okay. It has a special function and shape. What is the function of the atlas? Right. It provides a space for the head or the occipital bone to rest. We already said what is the purpose of the vertebral column? To support the head. So, the atlas happens to be the vertebra on which the skull, on which the head sits on. So, essentially it provides a receptacle, a seat, a sort of a seat for the head to sit on. So, the shape is such that it will seat the head. So, the joint that the atlas forms with the occiput bone of the head of the skull is called atlanto-occipital joint. It is called as the atlanto-occipital joint. Right. This joint provides for some movement at the level of the neck. So, the head movement, some of the head movement is enabled by the atlanto-occipital joint. So, some movement of atlanto-occipital joint is possible, about 14 to 15 degrees. Here I am moving a lot, but that is not entirely with atlanto-occipital joint. About 15 degrees of movement is possible at the level of the atlanto-occipital joint. Okay. But otherwise, it does not allow movement in the other 2 dimensions. Flexion extension is possible. In this movement it is possible, but these movements are not possible. So, that means that it is providing for stability of the head. Its main purpose is to stabilize the head and allow for a very small amount of movement, about 15 degrees of movement at the level of the atlanto-occipital joint. Flexion extension only in this movement. So, flexion extension, right, in this movement. So, that movement alone is possible. And the next bone is called axis. Right. This bone forms the so called atlanto-axial joint. So, there is atlas at the top, which is the first C1 vertebra, and axis at the second vertebra, which is C2. Right. The joint between the atlas and the axis is called atlanto-axial joint. Right. So, here there is, so this joint allows for more movement at the neck level. Right. There are 2-3 movements that are possible in this case. Right. It performs a large amount of rotation like that. And a lot of head rotation is possible at the atlanto-axial joint. At the atlanto-occipital joint, only 14 or 15 degrees of flexion extension is possible, but at the atlanto-axial joint, a major movement is the rotation like this rotation. Also, in addition, the atlanto-axial joint also provides for flexion extension, right, about 14 degrees or 15 degrees of flexion extension mainly, and some amount of lateral flexion. For example, lateral flexion means movement in the lateral direction, right, that direction. So, these are the purposes of the cervical vertebra, right, or the movement that are possible at the level of the atlanto-occipital joint and the atlanto-axial joint. Let us move on to other vertebra. What are the other purposes, other vertebra that are there? Thoracic vertebra, lumbar vertebra, right, sacral vertebra, and then coccygeal vertebra. So, between vertebra, some movement is possible. So, they are joined together, but they are not joined together in all dimensions. So, some small relative movement between 2 vertebra are possible. Okay. So, a major contribution of the vertebra is to bear the weight of the structures that are above them. Okay. So, by this logic, as the vertebra descends down, as the vertebral column descends down, right, the structure of the vertebral column or the vertebra in the vertebral column changes. Why is that? Because the weight gets added as you go along. So, the initial vertebra are necessarily designed to bear smaller amounts of load when compared with vertebra at the inferior level. Why is that? Because at the inferior level a larger amount of weight needs to be borne, is it not? So, something to keep in mind. So, each vertebra has a body, that is a particular body, and then there is a region through which the nerves can traverse. I mentioned in the purpose of the vertebral column that it is going to carry nerves that supply various parts of the body, right. This part is called neural arch. This part is called neural arch, and some other bony processes that are responsible for stability and also for regulating movements, for aiding movements of this vertebral column. Another crucial component in the vertebral column is the intervertebral disc. This is not a bone. This is a fibrous cartilaginous structure, right. It is more like a rubber pad. It is a fibrocartilaginous pad, supporting pad, that is present between two vertebra. It is a intervertebral disc, is it not? Intervertebral disc, more like a padding, more like a rubber pad between two vertebra. Inter means between, intra means within, is it not? Intervertebral disc means this is a disc or this is a pad that is present between two vertebra. Okay. What is the purpose of this? Why do you need a padding? Because it turns out that vertebra themselves are bony structures. When they interact with each other, there can be unwanted forces between them, and you want to make sure that force transmission is along the directions that are desired and not in directions that are not desired, right. In fact, so these intervertebral discs are strongly attached to both the vertebra at the top and the vertebra at the bottom. So, thus providing or kind of uniting them, kind of connecting them. The purpose is to provide padding between this vertebra and pass on the weight, helps in weight bearing. So, essentially to facilitate smooth weight bearing, smooth transmission of the weight from the top to the next level, from the vertebra at the top to the vertebra at the bottom, between two vertebra. The purpose is to facilitate transmission of weight in the direction desired, right. If not, what happens? There can be shearing between vertebra. This shearing, for example, if this is one vertebra, this is another vertebra, and there is no intervertebral disc, what can happen is this kind of shearing can happen, which is not a desired feature, is it not? In this case, the weight in this vertebra should pass on to the weight in this vertebra. That is maintained by this pad-like mechanism, which is the intervertebral disc. By this logic also, that means that the intervertebral disc must be thin at the cervical region and relatively thicker at the level of the lumbar vertebra and the sacrum. Why is that? Because as you go down, the weight increases. So, the necessity for padding also increases. So, the intervertebral discs become thicker as you go down, as you traverse along from the top of the vertebral column to the bottom of the vertebral column. So, the thickness of these pads increase because there is a higher need for weight bearing as you traverse from the top to the bottom of the vertebral column. So, within each vertebra you have this neural arch, which is divided into two parts. One is the annulus fibrosus, which is slightly on the periphery of the vertebra, and so that part which is on the periphery or more towards the outer part of the vertebra is called annulus fibrosus. Then at the center you have what is called as nucleus pulposus, right. This is what is found within a vertebra, right. This is the view when you are looking from the top, right. superior view. So, within the vertebral column, two vertebra and the intervertebral disc and the soft tissues between these vertebra together constitute what is called as a motion segment. It is possible for motion or movement between two vertebra. Right. So, two vertebra, the intervertebral disc between them and other soft tissues between them together constitute a motion segment, right, that within which movements can happen, right. And this is the basic functional unit of the spine, right. The movements that happen are the motion segment. Between two adjacent or consecutive vertebra, movements are very small, right. However, when we move, for example, when we want to bend down, I am making that bend, that is a very visible large movement of the spine. How is this possible? Because there is relative movement between many consecutive segments, many consecutive vertebra of the vertebral column. All of these movements add up to cause a net change in the angle, that is what is becoming visible as the bend, as the flexion of the spine, right. So, they all add up, and because of this there is a possibility for the spine to have a considerable amount of range of motion, a lot of range of motion. And what are the various possible movements that are there? One is flexion extension, flexion of the spine and extension of the spine, that flexion extension, right, that is what is shown here. So, when I move forward such that the face goes towards the ground, right, like this, when I move forward, that is called flexion, and when I bend backwards, right, for example, that is called extension or hyperextension, right. That is the other possibility. Here is my student, PhD student Anurag, who is showing the movement in the sideways direction or the lateral direction. He is showing the possibility that you can make that movement, right. This is not a movement that is happening at the hip. You might not be able to see my hip, but I am telling you that this movement is happening at the level of the spine, right. I can make that lateral movement on the right side and then on the left side, right. These are lateral flexion movement that is possible. In addition, I can also do that, right, that is rotation, right. So, there are these three possible movements that are possible. So, the net movement that is possible at any level of the spine is a function of the sum of the movements that are happening above that level, and in each motion segment the restrictions or the constraints are different. So, not all the vertebra can move the same amount. So, there are constraints that are placed at the anatomical level because of various factors as to what internal organs are present, to what extent these are possible to move, and many other such constraints. So, because of this, the net movement that is possible at the level of any vertebra changes. So, between two vertebra, or between any motion segment or between multiple motion segments, the amount of movement or the range of motion that is possible is different. Okay. Something to remember is that we should not confuse movements that happen at the level of the hip with the movements that happen at the level of the spine, right. So, if you consider within the sagittal plane, I am doing that, versus there is a forward motion of the hip that is happening because of movement of the thigh, the femur, for example, right. So, there is movement that is happening at the level of the spine, and then there is movement that happens at the level of the hip. We should not confuse these movements as spine movements. Not all of them constitute spine movements, something to keep in mind. Then of course, we all know what are the movements that are possible in which planes. This movement, that flexion extension, it is happening in sagittal plane, right, it is happening in sagittal plane. Then this movement, the lateral flexion, the sideways movement, happens in frontal plane. And then if I perform a rotation, that is happening in the transverse plane, something to keep in mind. Remember, we discussed anatomical planes and axes way back in the first or second week of this course. I request you to go back and review that content once, right. which planes in these movements are happening. Flexion extension is happening in sagittal plane. Lateral flexion is happening in frontal plane. And rotation is happening in transverse plane. All these movements are possible within the spine. So, vertebral column allows for movements in all the 3 dimensions, and any amount of movement that is possible in any of these 3 depends on at the level of which vertebra you are making that movement and constraints at that level of the vertebra. So, the details we will skip for now, we will see in future videos. With this, we come to the end of this video. In this video, we discussed a brief anatomy of the spine and the movements that happen at the level of the spine. Thank you very much for your attention.